In our study of Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga, he is leading us through a deeper understanding of the yoga of integral knowledge, where we have seen the object is the realization of the divine through the vehicle of knowledge. And the object of knowledge is always someone or something eternal, infinite, absolute. And therefore, we are left with a difficulty that the vehicle by which we seek to know that is itself the very opposite: finite, temporal, relative. Our mind is inherently incapable of knowing that which we seek. And therefore, we see that there has to be a kind of a transition. The mind can, at best, lead us up to a certain point in the right direction, prepare the ground, but eventually that faculty or power by which we will realize that which we seek is not the mind. And yet, if the mind is suitably prepared, it too can share in the experience of that. It can be turned into a vehicle of knowledge to reveal, to articulate, to express that which we experience. But what is it that we seek? And in the second chapter of this study, titled The Status of Knowledge, Sri Aurobindo describes that knowledge and what we mean by it. And we mean by knowing it a realization in the full sense of the word, that is, to make real to ourselves and in ourselves the self in such a way that we are fundamentally changed. It is not merely a glimpse of something real, but a contact which is intense enough that it changes us, and the realization itself consists of three successive movements. First, an internal vision, drishti. The second, a complete internal experience. And third, identity. And in that chapter, he had successively described each of these and the means by which we are to have them. In the internal vision by which we enter in the darshana, revelation of the divine visually, of course by an inner sight, he discusses the stages by which at first, by thought, inference, imagination, analogy, whatever mental means available, we attempt to form a mental figure or conception of the divine. And it is at this level that we see the largest mass of humanity. You can tell a child, you use the word God, divine, and he has a picture in his mind. And as children who were exposed to comic books, we had images of various deities. And so if someone says Indra, immediately in the mind pops up that cartoon image that you have been used to. But still, that conception in the mind can be an entry point towards something greater. But at first, this is the only available means, and whatever it is, it's good. And then, when we hold firmly that conception, fix it by an entire and exclusive concentration, that's when there is a penetration. The mind cuts through the initial figure, cartoon, reduction of an image of that, it cuts through that, that becomes the gateway. And the gateway, of course, is a very clearly defined border, limited, made of wood, metal, doesn't matter. The point is that the gateway opens to that which is real behind. And so it is by this entire and exclusive concentration, two keywords that Sri Aurobindo highlights. The concentration must be total. All parts of you must be turned in that concentration, and then exclusive, nothing else must be in the concentration. That's when we cut through. And then there is a breakthrough eventually where we have the realization, the revelation in the third stage. So this is the method by which the power of the internal vision is developed. And then this inner seeing is just a starting point. With that, the emotions have to join in. The heart has to be satisfied by its participation, and eventually even the nerves and the body can participate to make for a complete internal experience, which then moves eventually into an identity where the personal ego itself dissolves and only that which we aim at is present. This is the aim of this path of knowledge. And he says, indeed, it is the aim of all paths when they are pursued to their end. Now, in order to be able to reach this, we have to prepare ourselves, and the preparation itself, or the path and the preparation, Sri Aurobindo points to as two stages. The passage from the human to the divine involves two stages. The first of preparation, in which the soul and its instruments must become fit. And then the second stage, when the actual illumination and realization is brought in. And of course, we don't make too harsh a distinction. Each supports the other. The preparation leads to some glimpse. The glimpse helps in the preparation. And so there is a double movement. And this is the theme of the third chapter, called the Purified Understanding. The primary vehicle in this approach is going to be this purified understanding. And because it is through knowledge that we are seeking to realize God, the vehicle of knowledge here is our understanding. Still, we recognize the passage is going to be, will have its phases, rhythms and cycles, and all that accepted. How do we now prepare? And this is the third paragraph that we paused at last time. The first necessity of the preparation is the purification of all the members of our being. Especially for the path of knowledge, the purification of the understanding, the key that shall open the door of truth. And a purified understanding is hardly possible without the purification of the other members. So in the path of knowledge, obviously, the purification of the understanding is the key. But he says, the key that shall open the door of truth. It is a promise. It is a certainty that as this understanding, power of understanding is purified, the door of truth shall open. But this purified understanding is not possible without purification of all the other members. He explains that because everything is interconnected, although this may be our primary vehicle, the purified understanding, still everything else must follow. Otherwise, they can interfere and cloud the functioning of the understanding, as we will see shortly. It is for this reason you will find that in the Indian tradition, so much importance was given to purity for those who sought the higher knowledge. The word Brahmana, of the four varnas, the four colors, the four facets of human society, there are those in humanity who seek to know, and not just a secular, mundane, superficial knowledge, but a deeper knowing. Because innately, when our deepest urge is to know, We are never satisfied with superficialities. And the moment you try to know more deeply, you realize that your own subjective expectations, your own subjective conditions can cloud your ability to understand. You're entering a domain which is entirely subjective. To be able to know truly, profoundly, you have to sense as if on a deeper level, which is always easily confused by everything else. The day I am disturbed, the day my mind is affected by some strong emotional agitation, I find my ability to think, to perceive, to know, even to articulate, everything gets clouded. If we were to be able to see, if we were to see directly the subtle body, we would see like a cloud of dust filling the whole space, and the mind like a light which is covered now by this layer of dust or mist of different colors depending on the kind of emotions that have spread in the whole aura. And it's very clear that the light cannot shine through. And so there has to be a clarity of the mind, but the mind being embedded in all the rest of us, all the rest have to be purified. And so you can understand why the Brahmana, the one who seeks to know Brahman, the seeker of Brahman, had to follow a lifestyle which was strictly formulated to maximize purity. The problem is, though, when you try to formulate a lifestyle, you have to reduce it to material, objective, specific terms. And then the obsession with the finer details becomes prevalent. So, for example, in certain very orthodox communities, we still see those rules followed. Of course, the people may no more be seeking Brahman, they may be busy with other activities. That's a different matter. But if you see the rationale of those rules, you can understand why. First of all, food. The food had to be pure. Now, what does that mean? There are two sides to the purity, a gross and a subtle. The gross part of the food purity was that the food had to be sattvic, meaning not tamasic, which would dull the mind, nor rajasic, which would excite the mind or the senses and therefore cloud, but clear, light, sattvic, which would make for a clear mind. And so that was the gross part of the selection of the food, and the subtler part was the vibrations which go in the food, especially when we are seeking a purity of the subtler consciousness, because it is by the inner sight that we will have the experience of the divine, the knowledge of the divine. The mixtures on the subtler level were considered even more critical, and therefore you had to prepare your own food, or somebody close to you of the same kind of alignment, the same kind of idealism, the same grade of purity would have to prepare the food. And of course, this can be taken to such an extreme. And yet, the principle is valid even today under current circumstances. I made a particular note of an interesting fact that the people whom the mother had put in charge of what is known as the mother's kitchen, the person in charge was a lady to whom Sri Aurobindo makes reference without naming her. In one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo says, there are many individuals in the ashram who have had experiences, and some of them have had Upanishadic experiences without having a name for it. They just described what they experienced, and it's obvious this is what they had experienced. And the particular lady who was head of the mother's kitchen was one of those. And consider here a lady who's living in a consciousness where she has this opening to the Upanishadic experiences of the divine, the visions of Brahman and so on, and she's preparing the food. You can imagine the kind of imprint that goes into the quality of the food. There's another incident which is narrated by my teacher, Panditji, and he said there was an incident where they had washed some grapes and kept them hanging to dry to be given to the mother. And somebody passed by and saw those grapes and felt a strong sense of attraction. So subsequently the grapes were taken down, they made a juice and sent it to the mother, and the mother took a sip, and I think she She spat it out, was it? Because those vibes were there. They had gone into the juice and she could feel it immediately. She refused to take it. Another time, I remember Dyuman Bhai told us this, that one day the mother called him, I think it was in the late 60s, and the mother said to him, "Can you arrange to give this body food that does not have poisons in it?" And he said that that was his inspiration to start the what today we call organic farming, without pesticides and without fertilizers which are added in Gloria land. That was his inspiration to start the whole organic movement. But you can see how, for her, not only was she sensitive to the subtler mixture, but even to something which is nowhere felt in the tastes, the poisons which are there in the food today. Most of us cannot even taste them. And yet she could feel its effect in the body. So this you can see why food is considered to be so important in terms of purity, because it becomes the substance of our gross and our subtle body. Or in the lifestyle of the more orthodox Brahmins, they had to take a bath 3 times a day. Now that may sound a little too much, but if you see the effect a proper shower has when taken in the proper way with the full awareness of the subtler dimensions, it not only washes the physical body, it can even have an effect of washing on the subtle body. Sometimes we have this experience that we feel somehow our consciousness infected by some vibration which we find difficult to expel, and often it is by taking a shower that it is most easily washed away. And so you can see how a lifestyle could be organized to an extreme, obsessing in the tiniest detail on purification. And it could go so far as you regulate the time of sleep, time of waking, before eating, the kind of thing you should do to purify. When you walk on the road, you should do certain things. I had occasion to interact with one of these very orthodox persons, and he said he is not even allowed to drink water from the tap, because the tap water has come through so many different things, and he can only drink from the well. Of course, assuming the well water has not been poisoned, which nowadays is the case often. And then I said, well, what happens if through the day you don't get the food cooked by somebody that is part of your family or done by you, and no water? He says, sometimes I go through the whole day without drinking water, without eating food. And it is quite terrible for the body, but he just does it. And then I said, but what's the worst case scenario? And he said, well, worst case is I can drink water, but then when I go back home, I have to do a whole series of rituals to purify myself. So, another example he gave was he was not allowed to spend the night in certain regions of India, which were associated with certain vibrations. You know, the whole of the map of India is mapped with the parts of the body of Sati. It's very symbolic, but also profound spiritual truths of divine nature. When she falls into ignorance and falls apart, so to say, in pieces, is lost in division of consciousness. And the whole story is narrated how Sati aspired to marry Shiva, but for various reasons could not contain the full intensity of that divine power. And so there were a whole series of events. Finally, she dies and her body is cut up and the pieces fall, and they become, of course, the sacred spaces. But each of those pieces, the parts of her body fallen on earth, represents a certain quality of consciousness. And so certain parts of the land, he said, he was not allowed to spend the night there unless he spent the night inside the temple, where there is a purified atmosphere. So I studied all these just to understand how far that whole thinking could go, and I found it very interesting. Now, for our purpose, Sri Aurobindo does not get into those details. The principle is what we catch, the principle of purification of the understanding. and that the fact that this purity of the understanding is tied to the purity of everything else. This is all that we are looking at now. But I give you this background to show you how in the traditional systems one could really take it far. So we continue with the text. And an unpurified heart, an unpurified sense, an unpurified life confuse the understanding, disturb its data, distort its conclusions, darken its seeing, misapply its knowledge. An unpurified physical system clogs or chokes up its action. Now, you see, in dealing with knowledge, there are two parts. One is the taking in of knowledge, and the other part is the execution or expression of the knowledge. So, the last part is relating to the physical system. When it is not purified, it clogs or chokes up the action of knowledge. And that means when knowledge tries to act through the body and the body consciousness is not pure, the knowledge gets blocked up, and then what follows is a distorted expression in the body. Or there is a complete blocking or a choking, and the choking makes it come out in brief bursts but unclear, not streaming through with clarity. I remember reading long ago, when I was in my early teens, some literature from the Theosophical Society. And perhaps this was a book by Leadbeater, where he was describing the importance of maintaining cleanliness of the body. And he explained how most people don't realize if there is dirt under the fingernails, it has a tremendous effect. It has a tremendous influence on your effectivity in action. And he explained that in the subtle body, the energies stream out through the fingers. And if there is dirt under the nails, that clouds the quality of the energy. And one can see in the aura, the streaming light is as if muddied. And it had a deep impression in me of the nature of this relationship of the subtle and the physical, especially in the domain of action. But I point this out because these are all subtle things we hardly notice. Sri Aurobindo is making here a general statement, but we can see how far we could go with each of these. Sri Aurobindo carefully describes every kind of distortion that can take place in the understanding. So, first he says, unpurified heart, sense, or life force. These are the three things which can have the effect of confusing the understanding, disturbing its data, distorting its conclusions, darkening its seeing, and misapplying its knowledge. So there are 5 facets of the kinds of distortion that can happen. First, he says, confuse the understanding, and this is typically with the heart. When the heart is agitated and disturbed, and I'm listening to somebody explaining something very carefully, there's a certain urgency, there's a hurry, and I don't pay proper attention. I catch something, I miss something, and I don't catch all the implications. And I think I have understood when in fact the understanding is confused. And it happens so often to us. Later we hear or read that thing once again, and we say, oh, I missed so much the last time. Often when we read Sri Aurobindo, this is what happens if we are in a hurry. I have to finish in 15 minutes, and so I read quickly. And then I think I have understood, but much later in a different state of consciousness, I read the same text, and oh, how much I had missed, or how much I had misunderstood sometimes. So there's the confusion of understanding, pieces disconnected. Or he says, disturb its data. This happens most often when the senses are not purified. So the most obvious form, you're reading the text and a word is misread because the senses were not purified. Now the unimpure senses classically are described in this example where in the darkness or in the dusky evening, you see a rope on the ground and your mind sees it moving and the mind concludes that it is a snake. Why did that happen? If you observe, the first step of error was in the senses. The senses saw this shape, projected a certain interpretation by association, and then because the senses expected the movement, they saw in it a movement. So the senses have this ability to bring in a certain agitation in the form and appearance and a waviness, and they fill in all the rest. And if the mind sits above, the intellect sits above and receives this distorted influence, obviously it will have a wrong conclusion. But the error was of the senses, not of the intellect. So the senses have to be purified. They must be made absolutely calm, clear, solid, unagitated, unbiased, not prone to hasty association. And so, disturbing the data, and if the data is wrong, then of course the conclusion will be wrong. Third, distort its conclusions. So you see the layers. First, the confusion from the emotions. Second, from the disturbance of data from the senses. And then the conclusion, which get distorted. And it's not always completely wrong. It's just got perverted, distorted, twisted slightly. So very often we feel the validity of what we have concluded because it is broadly still right, but it's got warped slightly, and the warping is where the problem comes. When you see two people arguing for a very long time, if you observe carefully, both have a valid point, and they're standing on firm ground in a very narrow valid point, but all the rest is got distorted. And so the distortion of conclusions follows disturbance of data. And then when the conclusions are wrong, the insight, the seeing which looks through, that gets darkened. And this happens from various reasons. Most often when the life energy is mixed, unclear, dull, or weak. Although some higher intuition may inspire and show you a deeper insight, the mind is dulled, tired, it catches only a glimpse. It's as if seeing through a dark glass. You're seeing something, you're seeing the form, but you're not seeing in all the details. It's not vivid. And then when it moves into action, the knowledge is misapplied. And finally, the physical system. So you see here a full mapping of all the kinds of distortion, which all have effect on the understanding. And so, conclusion is, there must be an integral purity. Here also, there is an interdependence. For the purification of each member of our being profits by the clarifying of every other. The progressive tranquilization of the emotional heart, helping, for instance, the purification of the understanding, while equally a purified understanding imposes calm and light on the turbid and the darkened workings of the yet impure emotions. So for this integral purity, all the parts mutually help each other. The heart and the mind, he gives this example. And this is, as an example, the most common which takes place in our lives, that as the heart is made progressively more tranquil, it helps in the purification of the understanding. And equally, when the mind is quiet and has a clear light, that light can seep into the emotions and help to calm them. When you see a person who is very disturbed, approached and helped by somebody who holds the calm, you can feel how the calm gradually settles on the disturbed person and quiets the heart. In fact, this is the only way you can really help a person who is disturbed. Sympathy, empathy, giving a listening ear, etc. are all devices for connecting, to form a connection through which a calm that you hold can seep into the other. In itself, sympathy and empathy will not resolve the problem. By sympathy and empathy, you may even feed the excitement and the confusion and disturbance. The best and only effective way is to hold your own calm, and through sympathy or listening or empathy or discussion, whatever form of channel of communication, you allow that calm to seep into the other. And as the heart of the other becomes quiet, their higher understanding can begin to kick in, and the rest follows. It may even be said that while each member of our being has its own proper principles of purification, yet it is the purified understanding that in man is the most potent cleanser of his turbid and disordered being, and most sovereignly imposes their right working on his other members. So, if we had to start, we have all these pieces, limbs, members of our being. Each of these has its own way of purifying itself. Which would you pick that would allow most easily all the others to be purified? Which would be the natural leader for the overall movement of an integral purification? And he says it is the purified understanding which is the most potent cleanser. Not only from that purified understanding, it can seep in this light and peace into all the other parts, but it can most sovereignly impose their right working on his other members. So if the heart, the emotional being, has a right working, a right way to attain to the peace, the understanding's clarity can help the heart to find its right way in its own way. And so for the senses, and so for the other parts. So now we see why this chapter is titled The Purified Understanding. The whole focus of this chapter is going to be the purification and the establishment of this purified understanding as the leader, the sovereign, through which all the other parts are going to be purified to lead to the integral purity. Knowledge, says the Gita, is the sovereign purity. Light is the source of all clearness and harmony, even as the darkness of ignorance is the cause of all our stumblings. So, if we had to see purity of the heart, purity of the body, purity of our feelings, purity of our thoughts, among all these, the Gita says knowledge is the sovereign purity. When we have clarity of knowledge, all the other things can be influenced more easily. And when we deal with knowledge and ignorance, always the image is of light and dark. And it is interesting because it is not merely an analogy. That is the nature of the experience and the deeper spiritual truth. You notice whenever we have some higher experience of a spiritual consciousness, it is always accompanied by the sense of everything becoming clearer, brighter, illumined, lighted up. Even the insight that comes in a flash of intuition, we use this vocabulary of a flash of light. Because in fact, that is the nature of the divine revelation. It comes as a light. And so Sri Aurobindo says our physical experience of light is a reflection of a deeper spiritual truth, where actually in consciousness, light is the revealing, everything becoming open, knowledge being revealed, and dark is the concealing, where everything is covered or lost, pushed into ignorance. So he says light is the source of all clearness and harmony, even as the darkness of ignorance is the cause of all our stumblings. So it's not merely a poetic description, this is the nature of the experience. He takes another example. Now, we took the example of the heart. How is the heart to be purified? And the method of purification of the heart he takes up and then puts it in the context of the larger purification of the understanding. He says, love, for example, is the purifier of the heart. And by reducing all our emotions into terms of divine love, the heart is perfected and fulfilled. So, in brief sentence, the whole key to purifying the heart is given. When we try to purify ourselves of emotional confusions, entanglements, attachments, fears, and so on, one can go through very elaborate psychotherapy, elaborate introspection, elaborate exercises, and they will all help. But there is one thing which will have a dramatic, all-inclusive, immediate and lasting result, and that is love. If instead of struggling with all our knots and confusions and pulls and pushes and all the facets of their emotional distortions, we focused on one single thing: increase the love in the heart. Start with one single point, and it could start with your pet dog. Just open your heart and express love towards your pet dog, or your child, or your family members, or the divine, whichever is your starting point. Start one thread, one point of contact where your heart can feel and express love. And you'll find immediately, without doing anything else, all the other problems tend to become less intense. And when this experience of feeling and expressing love grows to however narrow a connection, gradually its radiance seems to spread into the other parts and melt their rigidities. And now the same anger, hatred, jealousy, lust and pettiness, whatever the tendencies, they somehow become less sticky, less rigid, less persistent. And so if this narrow passage of love could now be consciously widened and expanded, turned to many things, turned to others, or turned upwards, then all the other things would of their own begin to melt and fade away. And this is the best therapy. All other therapies are useful, but they are in no way as effective as this one therapy. So the purifier of the heart, he says, is love. And now the specific method we use is to reduce all our emotions into terms of divine love. Now, this is a very simply stated formula, but it has a whole complexity behind it, which he develops in the yoga of devotion later on. But the idea is that we begin to see all of our emotions and all of our emotional relationships as facets of something else, which is much broader, truer, deeper. And that something else is what we call divine love. And one way, or let's say the easiest way by which we could begin this process is first turn that love to the divine. As completely as possible, as widely as possible, as deeply as possible. Having done that, we turn to all other emotional relationships that we have and see them as facets or part of our love for the divine. And to the extent that we are able to do that, all those emotional relationships can tend to be transmuted, taken up into this larger truth of the divine love. And this result comes in almost automatically, that we reduce all our emotions into terms of divine love. And this is the way to purify the heart. And through this, the heart is perfected and fulfilled. And if this is the method we have to use, and the starting point is love, still he says, when you start, the starting point of love can lead to confusions and mixtures and other problems which he will describe, and it will be the purified understanding which will help to clear all those confusions and distortions, even of the heart's love. And that's why it is this purified understanding which can help set the heart into its most complete and direct way of purifying itself. So he explains how the heart's love can lead also to confusions and distortions. He says, yet love itself needs to be clarified by divine knowledge. The heart's love of God may be blind, narrow, and ignorant, and lead to fanaticism and obscurantism. You can see how it is truly a love for God. I love God so much that in the exaggeration of my love for this narrow deity that I see as God, I reject everything else. And I can even say, I do not love anything else which distracts me from this one exclusive, narrow focus of my love. So you wonder sometimes how somebody who claims to have so much love for God and so much service to God can be so mean and petty in his relationships with people. Sri Aurobindo has an interesting aphorism where he says something like this. I don't quote exactly. He says something like this, that I wonder at how easily human beings can fool themselves when they say they love God but they don't love humanity. Then who are they in love with, truly? Something like that, he says. But the idea is that when you love God in totality, eventually God includes all of his manifestation. And therefore, your love has to spread to include all things. Otherwise, it is not complete love for God. But this is the problem when the love is blind, when it is narrow, and it is ignorant. So it does not know these things, it does not understand that God is not just this little piece, this little name, this little form or word. And so it leads to fanaticism and obscurantism. It may even, when otherwise pure, limit our perfection by refusing to see Him except in a limited personality and by recoiling from the true and infinite vision. And again, the full understanding of this we get when we look at Sri Krishna's revelation in the Bhagavad Gita. Let's say the love is pure. The love is even more complete, perhaps. It expresses the love for the divine in all things, even in all people, even in all circumstances. But with the limited idea that the divine is this pure, beautiful, perfect expression, truth, harmony, purity, love, beauty. That's all the divine is. All the rest is not divine. So we often have these very limited understandings of what it is to be a saint, or to be a great yogi, or to be an avatar. And so we look at somebody and we say, oh, this fellow cannot be divine because, and then we describe some pattern of behavior. He got upset, or he used swear words, he threw stones at you, or he lied to somebody, or he used a deception. Rama, for example, he had to hide behind a tree to kill Vali, and that's not the proper way of the warrior. He should have come forward and fought openly. This fellow is a coward. Krishna ran away from the battlefield, and so one of his names is Ranchhod, the one who runs away from the battle. But all of these are our conceptions of what the divine should be like. And we refuse to see Him except in a limited personality which is of our own preconception, recoiling from the true and infinite vision. And what is that true and infinite vision? And when Sri Krishna reveals Himself, Arjuna is terrified. That's why Sri Aurobindo uses this word recoiling. If we were to be able to see the divine as he actually is in all his facets, truly, one of the most recoiling aspects is his terrifying, terrible, scary, destructive power. And in the Bhagavad Gita, it is described how he is eating up all beings, devouring in that force that we call time. Everything that is created is being devoured and eaten up. But it is also an aspect of the divine. The Asura is also an aspect of the divine in a particular facet and form of action to break partial formations, to expose limitations, to reveal where there is a lack or an insufficiency. And that too is a facet of the divine's working. And we do not know the divine until we know why and how the divine uses even the form of the Asura for his own fulfillment. So, even when otherwise pure, this love of the heart may limit our perfection by refusing to see him except in a limited personality. And if for some reason the divine says, all right, but look at this side of me also, I said, no, don't show it to me, it's too terrible. By recoiling from the true and infinite vision, what happens with Arjuna finally after he has had this overwhelming vision? He says to Sri Krishna, it's too much for me to bear. Please come back to your original, to your common form of 4 arms. And the vision is withdrawn. It's too intense. So the heart's love of man may equally lead to distortions and exaggerations in feelings, action, and knowledge, which have to be corrected and prevented by the purification of the understanding. So if the heart's love is turned to the divine, there are these limitations. If it is turned to the human forms, there are other limitations. But still it is love in the heart which will lead to its purification. So in the love for man, there can be distortions and exaggerations in feeling, action, and knowledge. We feel something, it can get distorted or exaggerated. We act based on our feelings, the action may get distorted. Or we know from our feeling this is true, that is not true, and again there may be distortions. One could, of course, look at many examples, but one which comes to mind, because it is amusing also, and it is in the context of our ashram. There used to be somebody who lived in Nantai, and it was for him something of a fetish to speak of or feel what he understood as universal love. So he wanted to come out and hug everybody who passed by. Perhaps he had some experience, perhaps his heart had opened in a particular way and he felt things, he sensed things, he felt a certain wider connection. But then that particular form of wanting to hug everybody was not exactly the most healthy or right form of action. And a purified understanding would immediately recognize, oh, this form is not exactly the best. But when that understanding is not there, and when it's just living by the force of the freedom of the heart and the insight of the heart, one can have these aberrations. And so one puts this also in the context of a common misarticulation of this truth in the more popular New Age culture of spirituality, where they speak of following the heart's passion or following the heart, listening to the heart, and things like that. I had recently an interesting discussion. I must recall the exact detail of it. So we were discussing about this feeling of the heart and the knowledge of the heart and things like that. And there were two people discussing, and they both used heart in a very different sense. So the person who was speaking more from the inner spiritual dimension of the heart said something and tried to correct, but that's not exactly what I mean. And so I interjected jocularly and I said, there is the heart and then there is the heart. He's speaking of following the heart and not the heart. The idea being there is, of course, the emotional, human surface, sentimental heart, and then there is the deeper, spiritually centered knowing that comes from deep within. We use the word heart for both equally, loosely. And so we have to distinguish between heart and follow that heart and not this heart. That was the play on the word. And he said, yes, you're right. But unfortunately, because of this vocabulary being weak, loose, not clearly defined, it has led to a lot of confusion for those who have followed literally such advice. So again, the point being, there has to be a deeper understanding. The purification of the understanding can correct these distortions and prevent them. So this having been given as a first introduction, that we have to have a purification of the understanding, which includes then everything else, because there is a support mutually between all the other members of our being. Now we need to focus on where and what is this understanding that we want to purify. And again we come to the same problem of the English vocabulary. Just as there is a heart and there is a heart, there is an understanding and there is an understanding. Which part of our mind's function do you call this understanding? So the next paragraph deals with this. Sri Aurobindo says, we must, however, consider deeply and clearly what we mean by the understanding and by its purification. We use the word as the nearest equivalent we can get in the English tongue to the Sanskrit philosophical term buddhi. So we now understand what Sri Aurobindo means when he uses the word understanding. He's using it as the nearest term for buddhi. Elsewhere, earlier on in the early portion of the Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo explains that he finds it necessary to use the vocabulary from the Sanskrit, because it is only in the Sanskrit language that all of these fine distinctions of the inner domains of the spirit have been given proper terms. So we come now to this term buddhi. Therefore, we can exclude from it, that is from the word understanding, we can exclude from it the action of the sense mind, which merely consists of the recording of perceptions of all kinds without distinction, whether they be right or wrong, true or merely illusory phenomena, penetrating or superficial. So sense mind is not part of buddhi. It's not part of the understanding that we want to purify. Of course, we will purify the sense mind separately, but it's not the understanding. This is the part of us where, as soon as we see something, the mind registers the seeing, and there's a first level of registration. So he says it only records perceptions without distinction. Is this right? Is this wrong? The sense mind is not concerned. This is what I see. And the sense mind has associated with it a faculty of habitual association, which he will be explaining shortly. So you see the rope and there is a habitual association of snake. You didn't even have to make an effort. As soon as you saw rope, the sense mind pulled the association, rope, snake, and the intellect which is watching, the buddhi which is watching, gets both. So the sense mind is simply recording without distinction, doesn't bother whether it is true or illusory phenomena. So I saw a patch of white movement in the dark. Was it a person? Was it a cloth? Was it a spirit? I saw a patch of white. That's all that's registered here. We exclude that mass of confused conception which is merely a rendering of these perceptions and is equally void of the higher principle of judgment and discrimination. So, when we see something, there is at the same time in the seeing a rendering of the perception in something. So, for example, and this often happens when we don't see very clearly, when something happens very fast. The part which has registered has to fill in the blanks. This is how optical illusions function. You're shown a grid or a drawing which has many lines, circular or rectangular. And as you stare at it, you find bright patches flashing. It becomes as if darker or brighter and keeps flashing. You turn your attention to it, this changes and that changes. You turn back, it changes. And there's like as if a patch of dark or white. Now, this is all part of the conception introduced by at the level of the sense mind, because the senses are trying to fill in gaps to make it complete. So the easiest way to make this optical illusion is you draw two lines which should have completed in a corner, except you don't complete it. Make a square like this with just the corners missing on a white sheet of paper, black lines. You stare at it for a while, and immediately you notice the corners get filled up. And then your attention turns to the corner because it's something moved there. You turn and you find it's vanished. The other one got filled up. You turn, it's vanished, and the other one got filled up. So it's part of the sense mind to do this work, a rendering of these perceptions. It does not have an element of judgment or discrimination. That is proper to the buddhi. Nor can we include that constant leaping current of habitual thought which does duty for understanding in the mind of the average unthinking man, but is only a constant repetition of habitual associations, desires, prejudices, prejudgments, received or inherited preferences, even though it may constantly enrich itself by a fresh stock of concepts streaming in from the environment and admitted without the challenge of the sovereign discriminating reason. So this is another facet of the functioning of the sense mind. Constant leaping current of habitual thought. You see something, there's a current leaping, and it's all habit. What is it throwing up by habit? Associations, desires, prejudices, prejudgments, and preferences which are received or inherited. It's quite a long list, but just as a quick example, we saw the rope and the association of the snake. Now, if you notice, the association of snake will be more vivid in people who have seen snakes or have had a bad experience with snakes. To others, that association may not always be as vivid. And this is part of the whole stock which we are freshly building. Whenever we have a new experience, it builds an association. And next time, a piece pulls the rest. We have desires associated with those images. So somebody draws, let's say for a child, he sees a particular shape of an ice cream cone, and pop, there's an association of a desire of food or something. May not happen so much with adults unless that has been ingrained repeatedly. So certain forms draw analogies or associations of other desires which pop up at that point. So advertisers use this very effectively. And why can they use it effectively? And this is in the rest of the sentence. He says, because all these associations and bundles of desires, prejudices, prejudgments, they take the place, they take duty for understanding in the mind of the average unthinking man. So there's a huge mass of humanity. I dare say 3/4 of humanity, according to some estimates, don't think for themselves, or at least in 90% of the time, don't think for themselves. So you're walking on the road, your mind is wandering, your eyes wander, an advertisement happens to be present, your eyes gaze at it and move on. There's nothing in the mind which is making an effort to think, to reason out, to discriminate, or to understand. So, in this mechanical automatic condition, this functioning of the current of energy leaping takes the place of the thinking mind. It throws up all the associations, desires, prejudices, prejudgments. Let's say you're walking along, you see a face in an advertisement, a politician's face, and there's a prejudgment. Oh, crook, corrupt. There's a prejudgment. You see a picture which triggers a desire of lust, and it has an effect. And you tend to associate now that image with that sensation. So you will see in all the car advertisements, they have to throw in a human being, rarely a man, generally a woman, generally in a seductive position, dressed in a seductive way. When you actually look at the advertisement, the woman is not what you're looking for. You're perhaps looking for the car if you want to assess the value of the car. But the association that that picture pulls immediately influences your judgment of the car. You remove the human figure and have the car by itself, there is no association to relate to. And so advertisers play with this skillfully and with great effect. Immediately an emotional content has been brought into what is otherwise a piece of metal. Very crudely shaped even, it's not even very aesthetic. But the emotional content now fills the whole idea of the car. When you observe advertisements, you can see how they do it very cleverly. So, a car, for example, has to be made alive. They will show a man and a woman going for a drive in nature. There's a child somewhere who is very happy. And all of that is somehow to be tied into the car. So this car is going to give you this happy married life and the joy of the children and all those associations bundled together. Tomorrow you see that car and the rush of emotions comes in. And you think you have made a judgment. I like this car, you say. I'm always surprised when I see people saying, I like that car and not the other. And I say, why? And then they're confused. They don't know what to say. You don't know the technical differences. Is it more fuel efficient? Is it driving smoother? Are its brakes more effective? Has it had less accidents? None of those things matter. The color, the shape is at best that they can physically connect to. What they are not aware is all those bundles of emotions that have gone in through the advertisements that they are actually using as the reference for their decision. So this is the point Aurobindo makes. In the average unthinking man, it is this current of habitual thought which does duty for understanding in the mind. And this is not the understanding that we want to purify. This is still happening at this very superficial level. So from the sense mind, there is a confused rendering, and then upon it there is this current of habitual thought. Even if it continues to enrich itself, that's not what we mean by the understanding. Undoubtedly, this is a sort of understanding which has been very useful in the development of man from the animal. But it is only one remove above the animal mind. It is a half animal reason subservient to habit, to desire, and the senses, and is of no avail in the search, whether for scientific or philosophical or spiritual knowledge. So in the animal life, this particular functioning of the current of thought with habitual associations was extremely valuable, extremely important, because that's how the animals could understand their environment and respond to it and accumulate through a stock of experience corrections to their responses. You see an animal, another animal, and you have to immediately decide whether this is dangerous or it is safe. A baby dog, or let's say a baby cat, has to be able to recognize what is dangerous to it. A couple of days ago, I found there was a baby parrot which was flying around trying to find its way. And I was wondering what would happen if the cat came nearby. Embedded in the parrot's instinct is the fear from the cat. Embedded in the cat's instinct is the attraction to that animal, especially if it's small and young. And this does function for intelligence. And most of animal life is driven in this way. One level removed above that is the same functioning in the human being. And since most of us are still half animal in our intellect, in our use of the intellect, we're not too different in our behavior. It is a half animal reason subservient to habit, to desire, and the senses. And this is completely useless when we want to turn to higher knowledge. And he describes 3 categories of higher knowledge: science, scientific or philosophical or spiritual knowledge. Scientific looks at the same senses but tries to unravel appearance for an underlying reality. Philosophy disconnects even from the material domain of realities, goes into abstraction of thought, looking for some deep, inherent, essential truth behind the material forms of expression. And spirituality is not even in the domain of conception, it looks for deeper experience behind all these. So these are 3 gradations through which one rises inevitably. All scientists who go deep enough become philosophers, and sometimes eventually even touch a spiritual dimension. All philosophers, if they go deep enough, eventually recognize that there is something else which brings meaning, and they open to a spiritual reality. Those who seek directly the spiritual knowledge often discard philosophy or scientific quest as inferior or insufficient in themselves. But that, I believe, is an error, because spirit fulfills through these tools, and we have to set right their relationship. But then Sri Aurobindo says, this being the level, one removed above the animal mind, we have to go beyond it. Its purification can only be effected either by dismissing or silencing it altogether, or by transmuting it into the true understanding. And this is the reason why first training in all spiritual paths tends to be silencing the mind. And which mind are we silencing? Precisely this habitual mind, which is our normal way of functioning or thinking. So, dismiss or silence or transmute. So, this is not understanding. What do we mean by understanding? By the understanding, that is buddhi, we mean that which at once perceives, judges, and discriminates. The true reason of the human being, not subservient to the senses, to desire, or to the blind force of habit, but working in its own right for mastery, for knowledge. Certainly, the reason of man as he is at present does not even at its best act entirely in this free and sovereign fashion. But so far as it fails because it is still mixed with the lower half animal action. So here we see the high status of this understanding, buddhi, and then he distinguishes that from the current functioning, which is half mixed in the lower animal instinct. So how will we describe this higher functioning of the pure buddhi? He says, that which at once perceives, judges and discriminates, the true reason. At once perceives, judges, discriminates. Now the way this functions, it sees, it judges and it discriminates in a single function. So unlike the sense mind, which sees only, does not judge or discriminate. This sees and does all the others at the same time. Now, if you try to feel inside us subjectively, in that part, where is this part where we are aware and in our awareness we discriminate and we judge? We get a sense of it in some part of the higher functions of the mind, somewhat abstract, standing back. We find it most easily when we observe our own thinking process. The part of the mind that stands back to observe the thinking process and criticizes it and says, oh, my thinking is currently confused. I am allowing these habitual associations now to cloud my judgment. What is this part? It stands back, observes the whole functioning of the mind and its logic and its associations and everything. But it stands back. And you see what it does? It's observing, but in the very act of observing, it recognizes, this is mixed. That is clearer. So inherent in the perception is simultaneously this discriminating, separating and judging. This is better, that is not. This is the true reason of the human being. And it is not subservient to the senses, to desires or to blind force of habit. Because it is not subservient, it is able to stand back and observe these mixtures. It works in its own right for mastery, for knowledge. So the moment we try to become master of our own thinking, of our own behavior, this is the faculty which kicks in. It has to stand back, observe, and from a free station be able to make judgment. Or whenever we want true knowledge, then we observe how our mind is unable to find the true knowledge because of its current working, and it quiets all that and cuts through to something deeper and recognizes a deeper insight. True intelligence is able to stand back from everything, observe patterns, observe relationships, and make connections between them and see some deeper truth which was not obvious. That's how we describe it in the domain of computer science. When we want to create artificial intelligence, make a computer intelligent, the first problem is we don't know how to describe our own intelligence and its functioning. The best we can do is describe it in this way. Recognizing patterns through associations, comparisons, differentiations, etc. But draw some insight by looking at different patterns. Oh, this is similar to that. This is different. This is the nature of the difference. That is the nature of the similarity. And then having done all that, get to some deeper insight. Therefore, this piece fits here. Therefore, this leads to that. Therefore, this is a part of that. Therefore, this is more important. This is less important. Therefore, this is true. That is less true and that is false. These conclusions emerge. And if you can get it through these 3 steps, then we say, okay, we have a functioning artificial intelligence. But you can see how the artificial intelligence definition is very close to what Sri Aurobindo is saying here. Perceives, judges, and discriminates. But also, it is working in its own right for mastery, for knowledge. Not subservient to sense, desire, or blind force of habit. So now we get some sense of what we mean by this understanding which we have to purify. So even at its best, he says, the current reason of man does not act entirely in this free and sovereign fashion. But it fails because it is mixed in with this lower half-animal action. Because it is impure and constantly hampered and pulled down from its characteristic action. In its purity, it should not be involved in these lower movements, but stand back from the object and observe disinterestedly, put in its right place in the whole by force of comparison, contrast, analogy, reason, from its rightly observed data by deduction, induction, inference, and holding all its gains in memory and supplementing them by a chastened and rightly guided imagination, view all in the light of a trained and disciplined judgment. So, this would be the pure functioning. Such is the pure intellectual understanding. Now, you can see how, let's complete the sentence. Such is the pure intellectual understanding of which disinterested observation, judgment, and reasoning are the law and characteristic action. If I were to read this out in a computer artificial intelligence class, it could stand technically perfect. You see how precisely he has described the full functioning of this free power of the understanding of buddhi. When it is pure, not involved in the lower movements, what does it do? First, it stands back from the objects and observes disinterestedly. Meaning, when I look at all these things, all these situations, I don't give preference to any. I don't say, well, I prefer this to happen because this is my brother-in-law and I would rather he gets his benefit. This is my favorite jalebi and I would rather make that my favorite. Or that I hate or I'm afraid of and therefore I push away. No personal interests. Disinterested observation. Everything is equal. Then put it in its right place in the whole. So it rearranges everything automatically. But what is the method of rearranging? By comparison, contrast, analogy. So this is similar, this is different, this is the contrast. This has a similar structure, analogy. And so in this way, automatically there is an arrangement that takes place. Just as an exercise, if you were to sit down and take a whole bunch of objects, you go to a child's room, there are so many toys, and you say, let's arrange this. You look at all the toys, automatically, without any effort, there's a categorization which has formed. These will go together, those will go together, those will go together. Did you even think of how you want to categorize? It's obvious when you look at certain things. So, these are all part of this kit. Those are all part of this activity. These are all similar in the material that they have. It's obvious in what categorization the whole thing is going to be organized, and you go ahead and arrange it. So there's this automatic functioning of a right place for each thing, which is there inherent. When you're objective, there's a right place and you see where the right place is. Then, reason from its rightly observed data. And how does it reason? By deduction, induction, inference. So when we have decided, all right, this is how it's going to be arranged, but you also observe and draw some insight from it through reason. So deduce between two things, from one thing to the other, it leads to a third, and that's a deduction. Induction, between two, there is implied this connection. Inference sees a similarity, and if this is like this between the two relations, that is like this between those relations. Now, if you look at how precisely Sri Aurobindo describes this, this is exactly how we measure intelligence in animals. We give them all these different pieces. We see how they arrange, how they relate to them, how they organize them. We see this, we see that. Does the animal deduce the third step? We see this, we see that. Does the animal induce the thing in between which is missing? And the most advanced which we see in certain animals is this inference. It's difficult to draw immediately an example, but The relationship between two objects reflects in the relationship between two other disparate objects, completely different. We see this and then we infer this here on two different levels, completely unconnected. And very few animals are able to go into this kind of reasoning power. And those who are like that are very close to the human, generally in the more developed apes and things like that. And after all this is done, first you observe dispassionately, you found the right place, you drew a reasoning judgment from it, then hold all its gains in memory. So when you have made a gain, it is to be preserved, not to be lost. That's how humanity has built its stock of greater knowledge. But when it is put in memory, it's not enough to just let it sit there. You have to do something more with it. Supplement them by a chastened and rightly guided imagination. So you drew all this from certain observations. You built up a stock of memory of many things. Now within the stock of memory, you can see, this is all leading to something else. We see that we started our journey as individuals, we formed family units, we formed tribes, we formed states, we formed nations. It's leading to one earth. And unity of earth is leading to perhaps an even larger unity of the solar system and galaxies and other civilizations. And we see these steps. And in the imagination, we start thinking, what will it be like when the earth is one family? When we stop warring, and immediately the imagination starts creating those realities. We will not have to waste so much money on arms. We'll be able to channel those funds into creative activities. People will have automatically more free time. There'll be less stress because we will not be warring over our limited resources. We would share them easily. And you're creating that life. And then you say, well, if this can be possible, why not I make it real? And then from the imagination, I start trying to create. So the power of the intellect through the chastened and rightly guided imagination is actually able to go beyond to something which has not so far been created, conceive of it, and then work to create it through an exercise of its own organizational capacity. And with all this now together, the buddhi is able to view all in the light of a trained and disciplined judgment. It does not rush to say, all right, I have glimpsed the peace, world peace, I'm going to rush out and execute it immediately by shouting everywhere, let's all have world peace. Well, they will just lock me up as a madman. So there's this part of the judgment which stands back and recognizes what is immediately feasible, what are the steps towards it, and in a trained and disciplined manner, it moves forward. Such is the pure intellectual understanding of which disinterested observation, judgment, and reasoning are the law and characteristic action. And this is the purified understanding towards which we are going to move. But this is still the superficial part of the understanding. Still, it serves a very important purpose in the spiritual path, as well as in the perception of the divine and the discrimination of the divine consciousness in our perception, in the path of knowledge. First of all, in the spiritual path, when we go through certain experiences, it is the same refined and purified understanding which will assess the values of certain experiences, which will put them in proper place, which will show where they are leading, and which will help us also to sift the mixture from the pure truth. Very often we dismiss what would otherwise have been seen to be valuable spiritual experiences. We dismiss them simply because we do not know how important they are. We do not place them in the right value. So somebody says, "Oh, I was meditating and I suddenly had this glimpse of such and such a deity. But it must have been my imagination, how I am." And then you move on. And you've just lost something very precious. You were given a jewel and you threw it away. It happened recently. So I asked the person, "Tell me, when you saw that deity, what did you feel?" "Oh, I felt so beautiful. I felt so peaceful. It was such a wonderful experience." I said, "Then it's not your imagination. If you sit down right now and try to visualize this form, will you feel the same thing?" He says, "No." So what came to you was not the image, but the full import of that experience, which came as a bundle, of which the image was a part. And if all those other things were there, the image is not just a creation of your own mind. "Oh, yes, that's true." So I said, "Next, you have to now sit down and recall that memory. Relive that experience and draw it out once again and let it intensify and grow in you." "Oh, yes, that's a good idea." So the tendency of the mind to dismiss something precious shows a lack of real understanding. On the other hand, we tend to exaggerate something else and turn it into a high experience and deceive ourselves. Both distortions are common in the beginning, and one learns very quickly to stand back, to not prejudge, to wait for the experience to unfold itself, to settle and reveal its own truth. And then after that, we still put it in a larger context of our spiritual journey. "Oh, yes, I saw a vision. I had a glimpse of something which happened the next day. I had a glimpse of the future." But these are interesting occult experiences. They do not fundamentally lead me to a deeper spiritual reality. And I can appreciate it, but I move on. I don't give it too much importance. So we have to have this clarity of the judgment from the purified understanding. But when we use the word Sanskrit, in Sanskrit, buddhi, we mean something more than just this functioning. So he says here, "But the term buddhi is also used in another and profounder sense. The intellectual understanding is only the lower buddhi. There is another and a higher buddhi which is not intelligence, but vision. Is not understanding, but an overstanding in knowledge, and does not seek knowledge and attain it in subjection to the data it observes, but possesses already the truth and brings it out in the terms of a revelatory and intuitional thought." So this is now the true buddhi that we are going to focus upon, and the purification of the understanding will span both. Sri Aurobindo has used this word, not understanding, but rather an overstanding. And then he has put a footnote on overstanding. He says, "The divine being is described as the Adhyaksha, he who seated above all in the supreme ether oversees things, views and controls them from above." Now, this is the relationship of the higher divine knowledge, which has a sense of being above. Adhyaksha has also the sense of authority, who not only sees but exercises a control over those things. So it is this kind of an overstanding which is the nature of the functioning of the higher buddhi. It knows, but it also has authority, control, and can wield what it knows. And you see, this is the character of intuition. In the intuitive consciousness, not only we know in identity, but in identity we have the power then to mold what we know. The superficial informational knowledge is something which you take in, you know, but you can do nothing about it. At best, you can exercise that knowledge in a different action. But in the intuitional knowing, you know something because you're one with it, and because you're one with it, the knowledge leads you to a power of action. You're able to do something with what you know. In the intuitional knowledge, for example, if you have the experience of a piece, you are one with the substance of the piece, and then you can imprint that piece into your body or upon a situation. Because you are one with it, it's substance that you are able to freely mold it, because you are the substance that you're shaping. You can will it to do something, or you can will it to change or to express something new, to draw out from it something. So, this is the character of the overstanding as distinct from understanding. It doesn't seek knowledge from data. It possesses already the truth and brings it out in the terms of a revelatory and intuitional thought. Now we're using a word here, intuitional thought. It is still like a thought. I'm still thinking, but the nature of the thinking is not processing data coming from outside, but something which is already known and possessed within. I am what I know, and in that I wield to observe, express, to do something with it. Now he gives an example. The nearest the human mind usually gets to this truth conscious knowledge is that imperfect action of illumined finding which occurs when there is a great stress of thought and the intellect, electrified by constant discharges from behind the veil and yielding to higher enthusiasm, admits a considerable in-streaming from the intuitive and inspired faculty of knowledge. For there is an intuitive mind in man which serves as a recipient and a channel for these in-streamings from a supra-mental faculty. So this is the nearest that the human mind gets to it. It's making a great effort. Let's say a scientist trying to understand something, struggling, and there's a great stress of thought. And as you're struggling, you have an insight, another insight. What about this? Perhaps like this. And so these are the discharges from behind the veil, something pops up. And you ask yourself, where did I get this idea? You did not create it. You were struggling to find something and pop, the thing came in. From where? I don't know. But it just came into my mind. And that's why he says, from behind the veil. There is a veil and we're not conscious of what's behind. But something there has the knowledge. And there's a discharge from behind the veil. And then that creates a kind of an enthusiasm. Oh, this is so interesting. This I can do. And there is an in-streaming from this intuitive and inspired faculty of knowledge. So the intuitive and inspired, the intuitive is more the knowledge aspect, the inspired is more the force aspect. And we find this in the scientist's life, in the musician's life, even in our daily life sometimes when we try to invoke a divine inspiration to help in the work. You will see a musician, at first he starts in a certain way, perhaps hesitant, but when the audience gives him the response and support, he knows it is being appreciated, he is more confident, and then he starts flowing more freely. And at that point, as he's trying to do something new, to bring out something new, there can be an inspiration that enters, and he feels suddenly uplifted. What comes through is so different from what he has practiced. And later he finds himself unable to replicate, because at that point the inspiration streamed in and brought something else. So these are those situations where he says the human mind gets close to this. It's the nearest it can get. So this higher buddhi is something much above, but it has characteristics, similarities to the lower buddhi. It also seems to be able to stand back, to observe, and to draw a deeper understanding of things. But the difference is the lower buddhi does this with knowledge external to it through the senses. The higher buddhi is wielding knowledge which it already has, which it stands back from, although it already has. It is already the knowledge, and it wields them in a domain of intuition and revelation. When trying to give a more concrete sense of what this works like, the best example I found is to ask us to introspect first with a simple question: do you know you exist? And you introspect. Where is this sense that I exist? How do I know that I am here, that I am even existing? And automatically one goes back to some center of awareness, which is simply without depending on anything else outside. Yes, I know I exist because I'm aware. I'm aware of my own awareness. Okay, next question. What are you aware of in your own awareness? What is the nature of your existence? What kind of a person are you in this part where you're aware that you exist? And suddenly there's a kind of an internal exploration. And you observe the nature of this exploration. You know, I'm a person who is naturally creative. I like to express these things. I like to play with those kinds of things. And these are my capacities. This is my potentiality. This is what I want to grow towards. And if you observe in all this introspection, what are you dealing with? Not external knowledge, not constructed knowledge. You discover what is already within you, which you already know, which you already are. And yet there's so many facets to it, and you draw them out. You rearrange them. Which of these is more important? Which of these is higher? Which of these is more lasting, more valuable, more true? And there's an automatic sifting that takes place. The same thing we did in the child's toys in his room, I am doing now in my internal room with my internal powers of my own consciousness. And there is an automatic rearrangement and awareness. But throughout, I'm dealing with things which I already am and I already know. I've just brought them into an increased awareness. That's all. And it is this power, this faculty, where we are able to most directly experience what Sri Aurobindo is describing here, of this faculty of the higher buddhi to overstand, attain, does not seek knowledge and attain it in subjection to data it observes, but possesses already and brings out in the terms of a revelatory and intuitional thought. And if I ask you now to describe what it is that you find when you're exploring your own potentialities, you'll sometimes struggle to find the right words. And yet, when you catch the right word, there's a click and the words just flow. And you're surprised because the thing found its own vocabulary to express itself. And we experience what this kind of a revelatory or intuitional thought can articulate as. But this is just the beginning. This is an entry point. This is how we can most easily understand what that kind of knowledge is like. So he says, and this is possible when we touch upon this higher functioning where something higher is admitted, because there is an intuitive mind in man which serves as a recipient and channel for the in-streamings from a supra-mental faculty. But the action of intuition and inspiration in us is imperfect in kind as well as intermittent in action. So the quality is imperfect, the action is not continuous, it is intermittent. Ordinarily, it comes in response to a claim from the laboring and struggling heart or intellect. And even before its givings enter the conscious mind, they are already affected by the thought or aspiration which went up to meet them, are no longer pure, but altered to the needs of the heart and the intellect. So how do we trigger intuition? If you look at the process, you take your data, you work upon it, and you struggle and you labor. Your heart is passionately disturbed and intensely seeking, or your mind is intensely working through all the faculties of its powers of logic and understanding. And then suddenly, click, something pops in. I found it. I have an insight. And Sri Aurobindo explains something which Mother has elaborated elsewhere. What he's saying here is, even as that flash enters, our struggle, which was calling, our aspiration, catches it and mixes it and builds forms which are already part of our habitual creation. No longer pure, but altered to the needs of the heart and the intellect. I like this. Therefore, the intuition that comes is quickly warped to fit what I like. I did not see, if I had waited longer, the intuition saying, yes, this is valid, but there is something deeper and larger. I didn't even wait for the whole intuition to unfold. They are immediately seized upon by the intellectual understanding. So, and after they enter the conscious mind, they are immediately seized upon by the intellectual understanding and dissipated or broken up so as to fit in with our imperfect intellectual knowledge. Or by the heart, seized upon by the heart, and remolded to suit our blind or half blind emotional longings and preferences. Or even by the lower cravings and distorted to the vehement use of our hungers and passions. So something high may come, but we have very quickly distorted it to fit something which we have already prejudged. The most common form of this is when you challenge somebody for something wrong that they have done. They pause, they think, some insight comes, and they immediately use that insight to justify that mistake. I did this because the fellow is thinking, pop, an idea came, and he has distorted it, justified it. And he is happy that he has fooled you, although he has fooled himself in the process, and the opportunity is lost. And a fragment was taken which was useful to distort, the deeper insight which was behind is lost. So the mother teaches how, when we seek, instead of going through this conventional method which happens to us, we struggle, something pops, it gets distorted, fragmented. She says the right way to do it is you become very quiet. You become very quiet and then you make a very pure aspiration to know truly. And then you wait. In the silence you wait until eventually by the call of the aspiration something is drawn, it pops in like a drop of light and then you wait. Even when the intuition comes, you wait. You do not move, you do not rush, you do not jump and say, I have got something. You wait. And then you allow it to unfold gradually, and sometimes layers and layers of insight may unfold until it is completely unfolded. And then, if by then you have trained yourself, you can even allow it to formulate itself and find its own words or shape or drawing or image or action. And it flows through streaming, and you are just this transparent instrument, and the intuition went through down to the physical detail of the action. When that happens, your finger will draw a perfect circle effortlessly without any training. Your fingers will move and play the keyboard or the sitar and express something which your fingers had never been trained to do. And it will be perfect when it happens. The mother demonstrated this a couple of times just to show us what was possible. I believe it was with Pranab that she did with eyes closed, the drawing, the sketch, or with Huta? With Huta. That she drew an entire sketch with eyes closed. She took the pencil, closed her eyes, and just allowed the finger and the intuition to work through the finger, and this beautiful drawing emerges. And what she was trying to show was that the intuition has to be bridged all the way down to the material tissue and nerve. And then this is possible. Kapali Shastriyar had developed something of that intuition in the nerves, in the body consciousness. And as he was working in the paints department of the construction department of the ashram, he had to mix certain colors to get the color required. In those days, you couldn't buy from a rich variety of shades. You had certain basic colors and you had to mix to make your own shades. And because the intuition had been developed in the hand, he would just pick up and the exact amount of the color would come, and he would pick up the next, the exact amount, and you could mix it and you had the color required. He didn't have to measure in a device. But this is just one example, one incident which is narrated to us. The point is, this can be done all the way down to the material body even. And the mother teaches us the method. At first, of course, it comes as knowledge in the mind. Eventually, it can come as even inspiration which works through the heart and eventually down to the body. But the first training is to become absolutely quiet and call with aspiration in all these parts and train not to get agitated when the intuition comes. Wait for it to unfold and lead the process. In advising people who are in a more conventional framework of life, this is too much to ask. Most people are not even trained, have not even trained themselves to silence the mind for a few seconds. The mind is so untrained. And so there I suggest a different method. I observed for a long time people who had some access to intuition in the business world, but who had no training. They would go through a very rigorous, exaggerated, excited activity to find an answer, and then either in exhaustion give up, and in the exhaustion there was a period of silence where the intuition would come, or eventually the mind would tire, the activity would still continue, but in the tiredness of the mind there was a kind of a calming effect and something would pop in. But they had the knack to recognize when the true intuition came and to discriminate from the mixture of constructed ideas. That was their skill. And they were successful in business because of this. It is my conviction that a person cannot be successful in any field, however material it may be, if they do not have something of this touch of the intuition. So observing them, I found the way which I would recommend to people who don't have the capacity to become quiet. And I say to them, first, you make a study of all your data. Let's say a businessman has to decide, should I do this or that? Get all the data you can, which is involved in the decision. Study it as thoroughly as you can. Go through all the advice you can get. You can employ whatever number of consultants, go through all the reports, study as thoroughly, so that your mind is convinced you have done everything you could and nothing is left out. The problem they face is even when the intuition comes, the doubt remains. What if? So this is to exhaust the doubt. Now nothing is left, you have actually done your best and you have exhausted all possibilities, you have brought yourself to kind of a tiredness, and then you stop. Let go. Give up the whole thinking, and it's easy to do if you have exhausted yourself. Go and sit quietly in nature. Go for a walk. Do something totally different, not engaging your mind. So you allow this state of tired mind to remain quiet for a while. But in your heart, you have the intention that some insight will come. So just hold that faith that you will get the insight, you will be guided. And generally it comes at that point, they get the insight. And because everything else is exhausted, it's easier to catch it. Some people who are more capable, I would say, after doing all this study, now sit very quietly, remain silent in yourself. Make your mind quiet and wait. And the important distinction is, the faculty which analyzes is different from the faculty which decides. The deciding consciousness is different. So you have used your mind to analyze, now you stop using the mind. The decision will come from something deeper, felt in the heart or felt above the head or something. Generally they feel it more easily in the heart. So I say, if you'll feel deep in your heart, not in the surface, deep within, what's the right thing? And generally this is the way I found most effective for people in a framework where the mind is not trained. But you see, the principle is still the same. Sri Aurobindo has given us a detailed description of what happens. And then implied from it is what we must do then to do it right, which also comes in the later part of the discussion, which we will take up next time. He says then, in the next para, if this higher buddhi could act pure of the interference of these lower members, it would give pure forms of the truth. Observation would be dominated or replaced by a vision, which could see without subservient dependence on the testimony of the sense mind and senses. So now comes the description of how this higher faculty works in its purity and in its freedom, which we will take up next Friday. We can pause here briefly for any questions or anything you would like to share. Yes. Okay. The question is whether it is, from a spiritual point of view, whether it is good to donate body organs. The mother was not for donating of body organs for those who have worked to develop the body consciousness or to bring the spiritual consciousness in the body. The reason being that the physical and the subtle are more intimately connected, and damage to the physical leaves its imprint in the subtle body. So, for this reason, it was not advisable for those people who follow that kind of a sadhana. Otherwise, in the normal condition, for somebody who's living a normal framework of life with no particular spiritual development, it doesn't matter. From a social point of view, of course, it is even useful that they donate. Okay, so let me put it in another way. The damage in the physical can have its effect on the subtle, a part of the organ removed. Now, what happens? Yes. No. When an organ is donated after death, when the organ is harvested from the body, as I say. So, let's take, for example, the organ cannot be removed when the body is completely shut down. It has to be removed while the life force is still in the body. Right? At that point, because there is still a connection with the subtle body, there is something which is harmed. So now you may say that the subtle body is subtle, it can separate, it is eventually not affected. Yes, that is true. But during the time that it is connected, it is harmed, and an imprint of that, I will use the word pain in the subtle body, an imprint of that trauma is the right word, remains as a memory in the subtle body. So for this reason, it is not advisable. Sometimes before the death, sometimes just after. But the point is the life force is still intact, is still connected. Mm-hmm. Yes. This is whether the ventilator should be shut down or allowed the person allowed. It actually depends on, from a spiritual point of view, it depends on whether the soul has left or is still present. There are cases where under ventilator support, the soul is still present in the body. It is using this as an experience of learning and growth. There are cases where the soul has left and the biology continues to survive because of the machinery and devices which continue to pump. By habit, the body continues. And in such cases, it can be shut down, it doesn't matter. The perception can come only from a deeper insight. Either somebody who has an inner sight, or even by those of you close to the person, if you can feel whether the person is present or not. There's a distinction when the person has left, there's like a sense of a hollow shell. And you will feel very distinctly. It's not a gradual thing. When the leaving takes place, maybe the transition may take a couple of days. After that, it's like suddenly the person is not there. It's a hollow shell. You can feel that.
Yesterday I went to one lady, but she was looking very calm and quiet.
Yes.
But the family members, they were in a hurry to remove this. I was feeling inside because that person, as if he is very calm.
You felt the person present. Yes. You felt the person present.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I felt the soul present.
Yes, exactly.
And I advised them also, but
Now, fortunately, we have more sophisticated tests, and this is interesting. They watch the brain through a brain scan. They play a music or a sound or words are spoken. Now, the body itself is unable to move at any part because of whatever physiological damage, but within the mind there is a response which is detected in a certain ripple in the brain waves, and so you can make out that the person is giving a conscious response. Yes.
How did science look at this? For them, he is dead or he's still
So then the science will say the person is still alive.
still alive?
Yes, yes. The consciousness is present still.
Hospital will not cooperate in that way.
Nowadays, you see, because earlier we didn't have these tools. Now the tools are developing, and so very soon, once this is demonstrated sufficiently, it will be, I'm sure, part of the normal hospital decision making process.
Because they were in hurry to take that organs.
Yes, yes. There are cases where people have been in deep coma, brain dead almost, so to say, for 20 years, and after that, the person suddenly came back to full consciousness, spoke normally, and described that for 20 years they could hear everything except they couldn't respond or speak. So it happens like that also. There was a case in the ashram, very unusual, where a person was on the brink of death, and then after that, suddenly, it was as if the death didn't happen. The person recovered enough and was eating enormous quantities of food, but was otherwise unresponsive. And so the mother was told something is wrong with this person. It's not the person at all, but she's eating huge amounts of food. And mother said, "Oh, that's interesting, because a few days ago the soul came to me. The soul has already left the body, and the body is continuing only by habit." And so she said, "You cut down on the food." And after a while, it stopped. The person left. I mean, the life force left. So it's interesting. These are odd aberrations, but they happen.
Yes, we have intuition to understand whether soul
Yes, yes, yes. So just to continue with that earlier thing about physical damage and subtle body, there's the example of injuries which have carried over into the next life. So, mother's granddaughter, Purna, she was one of those in the royalty in the French Revolution who was guillotined. And there was a mark on her neck where the guillotine had cut. The trauma at that moment, which is of the body, because the subtle body is so deeply embedded in the gross body, the trauma of the gross body transferred into the subtle body and left an imprint in the subtle body, a traumatic imprint, which then impressed itself into the next body when it took birth. It's interesting.
But we have to understand the mark.
Yes, of course. Yes, yes, yes. Of course, it doesn't matter. The meaning of the mark is irrelevant. The point being that something does carry over. Now, if an organ has been cut out, then the trauma carries over. In the next life, it can lead to some difficulty even with that organ. Of course, one can heal it, but these are things.
You said it doesn't matter. Is it true it doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter because it makes no difference to your spiritual growth now.
I wonder, I don't know why the mark stayed.
The mark stayed because it is at a level which is very close to the gross physical. The part of the consciousness which is close to the physical holds that imprint. Now, in the normal person, the consciousness has not been developed to connect to that level. The soul does not carry those imprints. But a person who has worked on the body consciousness has created a connection from the psychic being all the way to the physical substance. There, the imprints of the physical consciousness will be carried by the soul. That's why it makes a difference in such a person. Most people, it wouldn't matter. The soul is half asleep and there's no special connection with the body life. But still, for the spiritual growth, next time, it does not really matter that there's a mark or what the cause of the mark is. Whatever it is, one has to free from it and move on.
It means if the person gets any organ of a spiritualized person, that will help her.
Yes, it's an interesting question whether somebody gets an organ donation from someone else who has a spiritual consciousness, or the reverse, who has a very different consciousness. There is always a trauma. There is a trauma of adjustment, which is part of the rejection instinct of the body. They see rejection instinct purely in terms of cellular functioning, but a lot of it has to do with consciousness also. And the body is trying to push out a bundle of consciousness which is not its own. It is almost like an infection at a psychological level, which is the cause of the rejection instinct, much more than the physical. And then, when eventually the body consciousness seeps in and digests the other consciousness and infuses its own, the rejection instinct fades away. Now it becomes a part of you. But on the other hand, if the other consciousness is very much in tune and has something new and fresh, it can even infuse into you something new. And for example, a young person's organ coming in, suddenly you will feel the vitality of that youth entering your body. Depending on which organ, certain characteristics will be stronger, things like that. Yes, such things do happen.
Something related to that question
Yes.
I would like to ask you. You know, sometimes is they talk about donating the organs, but I would like to know about the. Sometimes it's very necessary to get the blood transfusion,
Yes.
and there might be some emergency,
Yes.
and you don't know what
Yes.
type. They just only test physically whether it is
Yes.
normal or not.
Yes.
But spiritually, no
Yes.
one would be
Yes.
concerned about
Yes.
it.
That's
So
interesting.
suppose if we get that kind of blood, I I don't think that this is my feeling that I don't think that it matters so much, because if you are spiritually oriented and if you have something in your uh, you have that kind of intuition in you, I think that dominates this. And this is my
Yes.
feeling.
No, this is in connection.
Yeah.
In connection with this, with blood transfusion, it's interesting. If two people are at the same level of grossness, you transfer blood, it makes no difference. But if one person is very refined in consciousness and the other person is gross, the introduction of the gross blood in the refined person will be extremely distressing, until gradually that whole thing is shunted out, cleaned up, and purified, which process may take days, weeks, months. And still certain elements of the psychology would be transferred in you, which you won't know where this came from. I'm suddenly finding strong tendencies for anger, and I don't know where it came from. I never had anger before. Okay, now I'm going to push this to the limit where you will see how much can actually transfer. These are experiments done with cockroaches. A cockroach is trained to navigate a maze. Okay, it has learned some knowledge. And then another cockroach, which has not been trained to navigate this, is given the blood of this cockroach. And the new cockroach now knows how to navigate the maze. Isn't that amazing?
What is it exactly?
The blood transfusion transferred knowledge, the instinctive knowledge of how to navigate the maze. These are experiments done in the lab.
Why on the cockroach?
On the cockroach, because, well, actually, it's more gruesome. I kind of simplified the experiment. To prove that the first cockroach is not actually influencing, they chop off the head of the first cockroach and fix it on the back of the other so that the blood is shared. Now the head is gone, the brain is gone, which would hold the memory, and only the blood is kept. Now, not just blood, there's other stuff going with the psychological stuff, but still. The head being chopped off, the new cockroach now, with this other cockroach tied to him, knows how to navigate the maze. I reduced the gruesomeness, but that's why you do it with cockroaches and not with more developed beings. But it is done in the lab, yes, this is really true. Now, this is the content of the blood transfusion. Blood is not just the cells, because our medicine is still reductionist. There's a huge amount of substance which is subtle physical. In the occult tradition, they call it ectoplasm, which is a plasma which is of a subtle substance which is infused in the blood, which gives it its vitality. And that is also being transferred. And that carries a huge amount of the psychological imprints of the person. And so if the gross person entering the subtle will be very painful and distressing, the other way, the subtle person's blood going into the gross person, his thoughts will change. He'll suddenly begin to have higher thoughts and feel different. So these things they will get transmitted. It'll make a difference. Yes, but here the issue is of consciousness. It's not so much their. So culture is often tied to refinement of culture is easier in people who are not extremely poor, but we have many cases where wealthy people have a grosser consciousness, poorer people more refined. So it's really one of consciousness finally. Well, he should be careful about taking in. Someone with a higher consciousness should be careful about giving. It's fine, but still, let me put it another way. Even when you give, a connection forms at a subtle level. You see, among the Red Indians, they had this tradition. When you became a blood brother, they would make a small cut in each person and join the blood. Why do you have to do that? Why can't you just join hands? The contact of the blood and exchange of blood creates a subtle physical connection, which actually allows you to feel the other person more physically, to transmit or receive energies or even thoughts. So when you do give blood, there is a connection which does remain in this way. So, yes.
Another question is you talked about the purity of
Yes.
food, etc. But even though we try to have the pure thoughts, pure buddhi, everything pure, we have to live in the world which is full of
Yes.
impurities everywhere.
Yes.
Forget about food, but the people, their mind,
Yes.
and we have to deal with them
Yes, of course.
regularly. The interaction is so
Yes.
regular. So, what do you suggest? That do we have to stay aloof, or
You cannot stay aloof, you don't have a choice.
we cannot?
So there are two things which have to be done in the short term and in the long run. In the long run, one has to strengthen the power of the purity, that it can overcome and wash out all these mixed influences coming in. When you train your mind to become silent, for example, in the beginning, you attain to some kind of a basic silence. When you go and mix with people, you come back, you find, oh my God, my mind is again clouded. But if the habit of silence is imprinted strongly enough, I can be in the middle of that confusing influence and still be able to remain silent almost effortlessly. In fact, I will influence others more than they will influence me. They will become quiet. Okay? So the power of your own purity has to gradually increase. This is in the long run. Until then, you struggle back and forth. So in the short term, what you need to do is create a physical space in the house, preferably in that space where you do your prayers, where you have something sacred placed. Keep that space extremely pure. Don't do anything else in that except your conscious meditations, concentrations, invocations. Create an ambience, aura, presence physically imprinted there that you can come back to at the end of the day and as if recover with the help of that presence your normal station of purity, of consciousness. Okay? So you'll as if set aside all that happened in the day, wash it all out as you wash your hands and feet and wash your face with the water, you wash it out, then go and sit there, recenter yourself, recover your center and purity, come back to yourself as much as you can, and then move around to continue the rest of yours in your space at home. So you need to create a space which will be for you like the support, the reference, which allows you now to recenter. And this is not difficult. This would take a few weeks at most to build, and then it can be strengthened more. And then even later you'll find if you have a space strong enough, you can be quite far away from the house, but just reconnect with that space, feel that, and you can draw strength from it wherever you are. The intention is important, but what you're doing here is creating a physical space which has a charge, which has an energy, a vibration that changes you. By constant remembrance of the divine, you are connecting to that source which is there already, not your physical source here. But what happens sometimes is when you might be in a condition where the remembrance itself is lost, then you need other kinds of support, or at least you come back to your support and reconnect later. For some people, you don't create your own space, but you draw from a space already existent. You remember the time you spent near the Samadhi or at the Matri Mandir and draw on that. There's different ways to do that. Yes. Yes. But it's helpful when you can create that in your own house because it's physically closer to you and it affects your physical vibes directly. This is the importance of the sacred objects. It's sacred because it is infused with that presence and you can draw help from it. If the presence is gone, it's just another object. Oh, I brought a stone from such and such sacred place. Does it have the presence? No, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where it came from. But if it has that presence, then this is the way by which I'm able to tap into that as a support. We can close with a chant of Om together 5 times. Om.